Hey language learners, get ready for a story that's so wild, so unbelievable, it could only happen in the crazy world of politics. We're diving deep into a secret group chat, accidental leaks, and a scandal that almost brought down the Trump administration. This is story-driven English, and today we're unpacking a tale of power, paranoia, and, well, you'll just have to see. Buckle up, because this is going to be a bumpy ride. The Signal chat scandal, a story begins it, was a quiet day in Washington, D.C. until a bombshell dropped that would shake the foundations of the Trump administration. High-ranking officials, including Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, were part of a secretive group chat on the encrypted messaging app Signal. Their mission, to discuss a clandestine plan to launch military strikes against Houthi positions in Yemen. The stakes were high, the details sensitive, and the operation meant to stay under wraps until an unthinkable mistake turned it all upside down in a blunder that would soon become infamous. Someone in the group accidentally added Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, to the chat. Goldberg, a seasoned journalist with a nose for a story, suddenly found himself with a front-row seat to the inner workings of the administration's war plans. It didn't take long for the contents of the chat to leak, sparking a firestorm of controversy that gripped the nation. What was meant to be a secure discussion had now become a public scandal, raising urgent questions about national security, government competence, and the very processes designed to protect America's secrets. The fallout was immediate. The leaked messages revealed not just the Yemen attack plans, but also the casual, almost cavalier tone of the officials involved, a tone that didn't sit well with a public already skeptical of the administration. Outrage erupted across the media and political spectrum, with critics demanding accountability. Pressure mounted on President Trump to fire Hegseth, Waltz, and anyone else tied to the fiasco. How could such a breach happen? Who was to blame? And what did this mean for the country's safety? As the story broke, it drew everyone in, journalists, politicians, and ordinary citizens alike, each trying to piece together the puzzle. This wasn't just a slip-up. It was a scandal with tentacles that reached deep into the heart of power. What had been said in that chat? Who else was involved? And how would the administration weather the storm? The answers would unfold in the days to come. But one thing was clear. The Signal chat scandal had only just begun to unravel its secrets. The Signal chat scandal, a deeper dive into the origins. Signal chat scandal didn't explode into the public eye by chance. It was the slow unraveling of a series of missteps, each one compounding the last, until the Trump administration found itself teetering on the edge of a full-blown crisis. What began as a routine, if unconventional, attempt at coordination morphed into a glaring of negligence, hubris, and the fragility of national security in an age of digital misadventure. To understand how it all went wrong, we need to rewind to those critical days in March 2025, when a single decision set off a chain reaction that would reverberate through Washington and beyond. It started, innocently enough, on March 11, 2025. Mike Waltz, the steely national security advisor to President Trump, tapped out a connection request on Signal to Jeffrey Goldberg, the sharp-eyed editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. On the surface, it might have seemed like a benign outreach, perhaps, a back to a prominent journalist known for his deep dives into government affairs. But the implications were immediate and unsettling. Why Signal, the app prized for its encryption, was a darling of privacy advocates and whistleblowers, not a standard tool for official government business. For Waltz, a man whose job demanded airtight discretion, to initiate contact with a journalist on such a platform was a head-scratcher. Was he trying to cultivate an ally in the press, float a story, or had he simply misjudged the optics? Whatever the intent, the move planted a seed of doubt. In a world where national security hinged on rigid protocols, classified briefings, secure lines, and vetted channels, this casual sidestep hinted at a troubling nonchalance. Goldberg, no stranger to the corridors of power, must have sensed the oddity from the moment his phone buzzed. The real turning point came 2 days later. On March 13th, Waltz or someone acting under his direction added Goldberg to a Signal group chat ominously titled Houthi PC Small Group. For Goldberg, the name was a neon sign. PC, he surmised, likely stood for Principals Committee, that rarefied circle of top-tier officials, cabinet secretaries, intelligence chiefs, and military brass who convened to wrestle with the thorniest issues of national security. The Houthi prefix was a dead giveaway. This was about Yemen, where the Iran-backed Houthi rebels had long been a thorn in the side of U.S. interests. A small group suggested a tight-knit subset, perhaps handpicked for a specific mission. But why was he, a journalist, in the mix? The inclusion was so absurd it bordered on surreal, yet there he was. A fly on the wall of what promised to be a high-stakes discussion, Goldberg's presence wasn't the only anomaly. The very existence of the chat on Signal was a breach of convention. The Principals Committee didn't operate like a casual book club. Its deliberations typically unfolded in secure briefing rooms or over encrypted government networks, designed to thwart even the most determined hackers. Signal, for all its strengths, was a commercial app, not a fortress. Its use for such sensitive talks was a red flag, a reckless detour from the meticulous safeguards that governed classified operations. Had the administration grown so complacent that it treated a military plot like a group text about dinner plans? Or was this a deliberate attempt to sidestep oversight to keep the conversation off the official books? Either way, the choice reeked of risk, and Goldberg's accidental inclusion turned that risk into a ticking time bomb. That same day, Waltz took charge, firing off the chat's opening salvo. He declared the group's purpose to coordinate on the Houthi issue and assemble a tiger team, a term that conjured images of a crack squad tasked with an urgent, high-priority mission. The language was crisp, decisive, and unmistakably military. This wasn't a think tank brainstorming session. It was the groundwork for action, a strike against the Houthis that the Trump administration deemed critical. The speed of it all was telling. Within 48 hours of Waltz's initial outreach to Goldberg, the chat was up and running, its members plotting with a fervor that suggested both urgency and confidence. Yemen, with its strategic perch on the Red Sea and its tangled web of conflict, had clearly climbed to the top of Trump's agenda. But the haste also betrayed a sloppiness, a willingness to cut corners that would soon prove catastrophic. By March 14th, the chat had evolved into a full-blown debate, and the cracks in the administration's unity began to show. J.D. Vance, a rising star with a knack for blunt pragmatism, waded into the fray. He wasn't sold on the plan. Warning of ripple effects that could disrupt European trade, a concern rooted in the Houthis' chokehold on shipping lanes near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. His dissent was more than a footnote. It was a window into the messy reality of policymaking at the top. Here was the VP, hashing out strategic disagreements with the likes of Waltz and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, all in a forum that felt more like a group DM than a war room. The stakes couldn't have been higher. A misstep in Yemen could inflame tensions with Iran, unsettle allies, or tank global markets. Yet there they were, debating it on Signal, oblivious to the outsider in their midst. For Goldberg, it must have been a surreal spectacle. Every ping of his phone delivered another nugget, names, plans, tensions all unfolding in real time. The breach was jaw-dropping. A journalist, unbound by clearance or loyalty, now held a front-row seat to a military scheme and the administration's internal squabbles. The potential for diplomatic fallout was immense. If Europe caught wind of Vance's worries, or worse, if adversaries like Iran pieced together the attack plans, the consequences could be such. And yet, the group chattered on, seemingly unaware that their digital fortress had a gaping hole. This was the scandal's genesis, a cocktail of arrogance, impatience, and technological naivety. Waltz's initial outreach had opened the door. The chat's creation had flung it wide. By March 14th, the stage was set for disaster. Goldberg, armed with a story that could topple careers, was poised to strike. The administration, meanwhile, remained blissfully ignorant, its secrets spilling out one message at a time. What began as a plan to assert strength in Yemen was about to become a lesson in vulnerability, and the reckoning was just around the corner. The Signal chat scandal, the breaking point. B. March 15, 2025. The Signal chat scandal had reached a fever pitch, teetering on the edge of chaos. What had started as a curious misstep, a journalist slipping into a high-stakes government chat, now erupted into a full-blown crisis, with military secrets spilling out just hours before bombs began to fall. The Trump administration's reckless experiment in digital coordination was about to collide head-on with reality, and the fallout would be impossible to contain. At 11:44 a.m. Eastern Time, Pete Hegseth, the brash and unfiltered defense secretary, dropped a bombshell into the Houthi PC small group chat, labeled a team update. His message laid bare the operational guts of an imminent strike on Yemen. It was a chillingly detailed playbook, specific Houthi targets, mapped out weapons, slated for deployment drones, missiles, the works, and a precise sequence of attack phases. For anyone in the group, this wasn't just a memo. It was a war plan, raw and unfiltered, the kind of intel that lived and died in the deepest vaults of the Pentagon. But there it was, glowing on the screen of Jeffrey Goldberg, the top editor, who'd been lurking in the chat like a ghost. This was no longer a minor breach. This was no longer a minor breach tour. Sharing such hypersensitive military details with a journalist, mere hours before the operation, wasn't just a lapse. It was a direct threat to the mission's security and the lives of the troops poised to carry it out. One wrong move, say, Goldberg tipping off a source, or even a foreign power catching wind, and the entire plan could unravel with catastrophic consequences. The gravity of Hegseth's message hung like a storm cloud, but the administration didn't have time to notice. By 2 p.m. that same day, the machinery of war roared to life. U.S. forces unleashed a barrage of airstrikes on Houthi strongholds in Yemen. Right on the heels of the leaked timeline, the strikes were swift and punishing, a flex of American muscle meant to cripple the rebels' grip on the region. Goldberg, still clutching his phone, watched it all unfold in real time. Around the same time the bombs began to drop, he took to X once, known as Twitter, to confirm the attacks, tying them directly to the chat's revelations. The timing was uncanny. Less than 2 hours separated Hegseth's team update from the first explosions. It was a gut punch of validation proof that the leaked plans weren't hypothetical, but a live blueprint, now playing out across the Arabian Peninsula. That razor-thin window underscored the stakes. A breach this close to execution could have given the Houthis a heads-up, scrambled Allied coordination, or worse. The administration had dodged a bullet, but only by sheer dumb luck. As the dust settled over Yemen, Goldberg made his next move. He quietly exited the signal chat, his mind racing with the weight of what he'd witnessed. A veteran reporter, he knew he'd stumbled into something seismic, a story that could redefine careers and topple trust in the government. But he didn't rush to press just yet. Instead, he picked up the phone and dialed U.S. officials, probing for answers. Was this group legit? How had he, of all people, ended up in it? His questions weren't just journalistic curiosity, they were a mirror held up to the administration's incompetence. Goldberg's instinct kicked in. This wasn't a fluke. It was a systemic failure, a glaring lapse in judgment by men who should have known better. His outreach was a warning shot, a signal that the story was coming, and when it hit, it would hit hard. Back in Washington, the strikes might have been a tactical win, but the real battle was just beginning. Hegseth's update had turned a simmering controversy into a 5-alarm fire. The chat's contents weren't abstract anymore. They were tied to real explosions, real targets, real lives. And Goldberg, the uninvited guest, had it all. Names, plans, timestamps. His presence in the chat had already been a disaster waiting to happen. Now, it was a loaded gun. The administration's casual use of Signal, its failure to vet the group, its cavalier sharing of classified intelligence, all pointed to a deeper rot. How could the nation's top brass be so sloppy? How could they not see the risk of a journalist in their midst? For Goldberg, the day was a whirlwind of revelation, restraint. He'd seen the inner workings of a war machine, watched a plan hatch and execute, and now held the power to expose it all. His departure from the chat wasn't an end, but a beginning, the moment he shifted from observer to actor. The administration, meanwhile, basked in the glow of their Yemen triumph, oblivious to the storm brewing. They'd won the battle, sure, but the war for their credibility was about to ignite. The Signal chat scandal had found its breaking point, and the reckoning was only hours away. The Signal chat scandal. The players take the stages. The dust from the Yemen airstrike settled, and the Signal chat scandal barreled toward its inevitable reckoning. The spotlight swiveled to the key figures caught in its web. At the heart of the storm stood Pete Hegseth, the Trump administration's freshly minted defense secretary, man whose role in the fiasco would come to define both his tenure and the scandal itself. His actions, his background, and his response painted a vivid portrait of a leader thrust into a crucible he wasn't fully prepared to handle. Pete Hegseth, the unorthodox warrior put Hegseth's ascent to defense secretary, was a tale of grit, loyalty, and no small amount of controversy. Confirmed on January 24, 2025, his appointment had been a nail-biter, a tied Senate vote, broken only by Vice President J.D. Vance's decisive nod. It was a razor-thin victory for a man who'd spent years outside the traditional corridors of power. Before stepping into the Pentagon's top job, Hegseth had carved out a name as a Fox News host and author, his sharp commentary and populist flair making him a darling of the Trump base. His military credentials were real service in the National Guard with deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, but they came with a caveat. He'd never led a sprawling bureaucracy like the Department of Defense. To many, he was an outsider pick, a wild card whose brash style and unfiltered persona raised eyebrows among Washington's old guard. Past allegations of personal misconduct only fueled the debate, casting him as a polarizing figure even before he took the oath. In the Signal chat, Hegseth didn't just participate, he drove the narrative. He was neck-deep in the discussions about when and why to strike Yemen, hashing out the Houthi threat with the likes of Mike Waltz and J.D. Vance. His moment of infamy came on March 15th, when he posted the fateful team update, spilling operational details, targets, weapons, attack sequences, to the chat with a bluntness that matched his TV persona. It was a stunning move, not just for its recklessness, but for what it revealed about his approach. This wasn't a seasoned bureaucrat, tiptoeing through protocol. This was a man acting like he was still on a cable news set, where bold declarations trumped discretion. That Jeffrey Goldberg, a journalist, was privy to it all only amplified the blunder. Hegseth had handed the scandal its smoking gun. The leak blew up. Hegseth's response was pure instinct, tanned pure defiance. He didn't hesitate to push back, flatly denying that he'd messaged war plans, and branding Goldberg a liar in a barrage of public statements. It was a classic play from his media playbook: deflect, attack, and control the narrative. But the facts were stubborn. Screenshots didn't lie, and the Yemen strikes synced too neatly with his update to dismiss. His denial rang hollow, a desperate bid to dodge accountability rather than confront the security breach had for a defense secretary whose job demanded precision and trust. It was a shaky start to a tenure already on thin ice. Digging deeper, Hegseth's role in the scandal wasn't just a fluke hit, was a collision of his past and present. Appointed less than 2 months earlier, he was still finding his footing in a role that dwarfed his prior experience. Leading Fox News segments didn't translate to steering a global military machine, and his limited time in government left him lean on the instincts that come with navigating classified waters. A more seasoned hand might have paused before firing off sensitive intel on Signal. Hegseth charged ahead, perhaps eager to prove his mettle. His military background gave him confidence in war talk, but it didn't equip him for the bureaucratic tightrope of secrecy. That eagerness to act decisively, to show strength, may have clouded his judgment, turning a routine coordination into a national security nightmare. Then there was his media. DNA, years on Fox, had honed a reflex to spin and counterpunch, not to introspect. His attack on Goldberg wasn't just denial, it was performance, a bid to rally supporters and muddy the waters. But the Pentagon wasn't a studio, and this wasn't a debate he could win with sound bites. The stakes were lives, alliances, and the credibility of an administration already under siege. His lack of caution in the chat and his combative stance after the fact suggested a man out of his depth, a rookie misreading the room and the risks. Hegseth wasn't the scandal's architect. Mike Waltz had opened the door by adding Goldberg, but he was its accelerant. His team update turned a simmering breach into an inferno, and his response fanned the flames. For a defense secretary so new to the job, the Signal chat wasn't just a misstep. It was a defining moment, one that exposed the perils of placing an untested loyalist in a role where precision and restraint were non-negotiable. As the story broke wider, Hegseth stood at its center, a lightning rod for criticism, a symbol of the administration's gamble, and a question mark for what came next. The scandal was no longer just about a chat, it was about the man who'd lit the fuse. The Signal Chat scandal, Mike Waltz enters the frieze. The Signal Chat scandal spiraled into a national crisis. Another figure emerged from the shadows to share the spotlight. The blame with Pete Hegseth. Mike Waltz, President Trump's national security advisor, wasn't just a participant in the fiasco. He was its unwitting architect, the man who'd set the dominoes tumbling with a single, inexplicable click. His role in the saga wasn't as loud as Hegseth's, but it was every bit as pivotal and far more perplexing, given his pedigree. To understand Waltz's part in this unraveling drama, we need to peel back the layers of his career, his decisions, and the mounting pressure now threatening to topple him. Mike Waltz, the soldier-turned-strategist Mike Waltz, stepped into the role of National Security Advisor with a resume that screamed credibility. Appointed by Trump in November 2024, he officially took the reins on January 20, 2025, bringing with him a blend of military grit and political savvy. A former U.S. congressman from Florida's 6th District, serving from 2019 to 2025 head, made history as the first Army Special Forces member elected to Congress, a badge of honor that underscored his Green Beret roots. Waltz wasn't new to the national security game either. He'd clocked time at the Pentagon as a defense policy director and served as a counterterrorism advisor to a previous vice president, roles that demanded a keen grasp of classified operations and interagency chess. On paper, he was a natural fit for Trump's inner circle, a battle-tested patriot with a knack for navigating Washington's tangled web. Yet it was Waltz who lit the match that ignited the scandal. On March 11, 2025, he sent that fateful signal connection request to Jeffrey Goldberg, the Atlantic's editor-in-chief. 2 days later, on March 13th, he doubled down, adding Goldberg to the Houthi PC small group chat, a move that would haunt him. As the group's instigator, Waltz didn't just join the Yemen strike talks, he shaped them, diving into the why. And when of the operation, alongside Hegseth and Vice President J.D. Vance, his fingerprints were all over the chat's early days. From its creation to its purpose, coordinating a tiger team to tackle the Houthi threat. It was Waltz who framed the discussion, Waltz who set the tone, and Waltz who, inexplicably, invited a journalist into the fold. The fallout was swift and brutal. As the leak's scope became clear, military plans exposed, airstrikes launched. Goldberg, poised to break the story, Waltz found himself in the crosshairs. Reports trickled out that Trump was weighing his options, with whispers of a potential firing gaining traction. For a national security advisor, barely 2 months into the job, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Waltz wasn't just facing scrutiny, he was staring down the barrel of a career-defining reckoning, one that could end his tenure before it truly began. Waltz's role demands a closer look, because it's a paradox wrapped in a riddle. As National Security Advisor, he was the president's right hand on all things defense and diplomacy, tasked with synthesizing intelligence, corralling agencies, and keeping secrets locked tight. Adding Goldberg to the chat wasn't a minor. Oops, it was a jaw-dropping breach of judgment, a violation of the trust at the core of his position. How could someone with his background make such a rookie mistake? His military service years in special forces, deployments in hot zones should have drilled in the sanctity of operational security. His Pentagon stint and congressional tenure should have taught him the perils of loose lips in a town where leaks were blood sport. Yet there he was, handing Goldberg a golden ticket to the administration's war room. Theories swirl around Waltz's misstep. Was it a simple error, an accidental tap on the wrong contact in a rushed moment? Signal's interface wasn't exactly foolproof, and a fat-fingered invite wasn't out of the question. Or was it something mercurial, deliberate outreach gone awry? Perhaps Waltz saw Goldberg as a potential conduit, a way to shape the narrative around the Yemen strikes before they hit. If so, it backfired spectacularly. More likely, though, is a simpler truth. Waltz underestimated the stakes. Years in Congress and on TV might have dulled his edge, lulling him into a false sense of security about what could be shared and where. Signal, with its encrypted sheen, might have felt safe enough for a quick huddle, till at WASN single quotes to dot his involvement didn't stop at the invite. Waltz was an active player in the chat, pushing the Yemen agenda with a soldier's focus. He debated timing, weighed rationales, and rallied the team's standard fare for his role. But reckless, on an unvetted platform with an outsider in tow. That he didn't double-check the group's roster or notice, Goldberg's silence speaks to a lapse. That's hard to square with his experience. A national security advisor's job is to anticipate risks, not create them. And Waltz's failure to lock down the chat was a sin of omission, as damning as Hegseth's overt disclosures. Now, with Trump reportedly mulling his fate, Waltz stands at a crossroads. The president's loyalty was legendary until it wasn't tanned. A scandal this explosive could tip the scales. Waltz's military bona fides and policy chops might not save him. If Trump saw him as the weak link who'd jeopardized a win in Yemen, the pressure was palpable. Every misstep magnified, every whisper of dismissal a dagger. For a man who'd built his career on discipline and duty, the irony was bitter. His own hand had sown the chaos, now threatening to undo him. Waltz wasn't the loudest voice in the scandal that was Hegseth, but he was its enabler. His decision to bring Goldberg in opened the floodgates. His stewardship of the chat let the waters rise. Where Hegseth fueled the fire with bravado, Waltz had stoked it with negligence. Together, they formed a perfect storm of inexperience and overconfidence. And as the administration braced for the story to break, Waltz's fate hung in the balance. The soldier-strategist had marched into battle unprepared on. The consequences were closing in. The signal chat scandal, Jeffrey Goldberg steps into the spotlight amid the chaos of the signal chat scandal. One figure stood apart, not as a perpetrator, but as the unlikely catalyst who would bring the whole mess crashing into the public eye. Jeffrey Goldberg, the seasoned editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, wasn't a government insider or a military strategist. He was a journalist, a storyteller with a knack for uncovering truth sand. In March 2025. He found himself handed a story so explosive it would redefine the Trump administration's legacy. His role in the saga was passive, yet pivotal. A witness turned whistleblower whose actions would ignite a firestorm of debate about security, ethics, and the power of the press. Jeffrey Goldberg, the accidental insider. Goldberg's journey into the scandal began quietly on March 11, 2025, when his Signal app buzzed with a connection request from Mike Waltz, Trump's national security advisor. For a man of Goldberg's stature helming The Atlantic, a bastion of long-form journalism with a reputation for dissecting power, it wasn't unusual to cross paths with high-profile figures, but Waltz's outreach raised an eyebrow. Why Signal? What did a national security heavyweight want with a reporter on a platform built for privacy? Goldberg, a veteran of Washington's political trenches, likely sensed something brewing, though he couldn't have predicted the Pandora's box. About to open 2 days later, on March 13th, the stakes skyrocketed. Waltz added him to the Houthi PC small group chat, thrusting Goldberg into a digital war room where Trump's top officials, Pete Hegseth, J.D. Vance, were plotting airstrikes on Yemen. For the next few days, he lurched silently and invisible. Observer to a cascade of revelations. He watched as the group debated strategy, hashed out timelines, and bickered over implications. Then, on March 15th, came the clincher. Hegseth's team update, a detailed rundown of targets, weapons, and attack sequences, dropped into the chat just hours before U.S. bombs rained down on Houthi positions. Goldberg had a front-row seat to history and a ticking time bomb of a scoop. What followed was pure journalistic instinct. After the strikes hit and he'd verified their timing via X posts, Goldberg slipped out of the chat and got to work. He reached out to U.S. officials, probing the group's legitimacy and his bizarre inclusion, before penning a blockbuster for The Atlantic. When the article dropped, it was a thunderclap laying bare the Signal chat's contents, the Yemen operation, and the administration's staggering security lapse. Names were named, messages quoted, and the timeline meticulously traced. Goldberg didn't just report the news, he became it, transforming a fluke invitation into a defining moment of accountability. Goldberg's role was unique. He didn't seek this story, it sought him. Unlike Hegseth and Waltz, he bore no responsibility for the breach. He was the unintended recipient of a government's carelessness. Yet his decision to publish thrust him into the scandal's heart, raising thorny questions about his duty as a journalist versus the risks to national security. Critics might argue he should have hesitated, that airing military plans even after the fact could embolden enemies or strain alliances. Supporters, though, saw a higher calling, exposing a flaw so gaping it demanded public reckoning. The ethical tightrope was real, balancing transparency against potential harm, but the original sin wasn't his. It belonged to the officials who'd let him in. His background shaped his response. Goldberg wasn't some greenhorn blogger. He was a titan of journalism, with decades covering national security, war, and the corridors of power. He'd interviewed presidents, embedded with troops, and earned a reputation for rigor and nuance. That experience gave him the tools to recognize the chat's gravity and the credibility to wield it. When Hegseth's update landed, Goldberg didn't flinch. He processed it with the calm of a pro who'd seen sensitive leaks before. His choice to verify with officials before publishing showed restraint, a nod to the stakes, but his ultimate move going public was textbook journalism. To him, the public's right to know trumped the administration's embarrassment, especially when the breach wasn't hypothetical but tied to real bombs and real lives. Goldberg's article didn't just break the story, it reframed it by laying out the chat's inner workings. He shifted the narrative from a successful Yemen strike to a damning security failure. He named Waltz as the instigator, Hegseth as the loose cannon, and painted a picture of an administration so cavalier it couldn't lock its own doors. The piece wasn't sensationalist, it was surgical, letting the facts speak for themselves. And they roared, a national security advisor inviting a reporter into a war plan, a defense secretary spilling ops details, all on a platform never meant for such secrets. Goldberg's pen turned their blunder into a mirror, forcing the nation to confront what it revealed. In the scandal's tapestry, Goldberg was the thread that pulled it apart. He didn't create them as Waltz, and Hegseth did that, but he ensured it couldn't be swept under the rug. His role was reactive, not proactive, yet it carried the weight of consequence. The administration might have hoped to spin the Yemen win. Goldberg made sure the story was the leak, not the victory. Ethically, he walked a line some saw heroism, others recklessness, but as a journalist, he fulfilled his mandate to shine light where shadows loomed. And as the fallout rained down from Trump's fury to calls for firings, Goldberg stood as the man who'd turned an accident into a reckoning. The chat was their mistake. The story was his triumph. The Signal chat scandal. Inside the Houthi PC small group, the Houthi PC small group chat wasn't just a digital blunder. It was a window into the Trump administration's inner sanctum, a real-time chronicle of ambition, discord, and recklessness. What unfolded within its encrypted walls, exposed by Jeffrey Goldberg's bombshell Atlantic article, wasn't a tidy script, but a chaotic tapestry of planning, arguing, and celebrating, all shadowed by a security breach that loomed larger with every message. To understand the scandal's depths, we need to dissect the leaked conversations, line by line, and see how they built a house of cards that collapsed under its own weight. The setup, Waltz's vision, takes shape. All kicked off with Mike Waltz, the national security advisor who birthed the chat on March 13, 2025. With a clear mission, coordinate on the Houthi issue and assemble a tiger team to drive the effort. The language was crisp, military Waltz's Green Beret roots shining through. This wasn't a casual brainstorm, it was a deliberate huddle of heavy hitters: Waltz, Pete Hegseth, J.D. Vance, and possibly others, laser-focused on a single target: the Houthi rebels in Yemen. The group's creation signaled Trump's priority, a swift, decisive strike to flex American muscle and counter Iran's proxies. Waltz's push for a dedicated task force underscored the urgency, a sign that the administration saw this as a linchpin in its Middle East strategy. But the choice of Signula commercial app, not a classified channel, hinted at the first crack in the foundation. Collaboration was the goal. Secrecy, it seemed, was an afterthought. Policy fault lines. Vance versus the Hawks tension flared early when Vice President J.D. Vance threw a wrench into the works. On March 14th, he voiced unease about the strike's timing, warning of negative impacts on European trade. The Houthis' chokehold on Red Sea shipping lanes made his concern real disruptions could ripple across global markets, alienating allies already jittery about U.S. moves. Vance didn't just question, he pushed to delay a rare public crack. In the administration's unity, this wasn't a sidelined VP tossing out hypotheticals, it was a high-stakes policy clash. pitting economic caution against military momentum. That it played out on an unclassified platform, with Goldberg silently watching, was a red flag waving in neon. A debate this weight-freighted with diplomatic and economic stakes belonged in a secure briefing room, not a group chat. Dissent exposed not just internal friction, but the sheer folly of the medium. Intelligence on the line. A shadowy present-set chat's sensitivity spiked with references to real and current intelligence activities, possibly from CIA Director John Ratcliffe, though his direct involvement remains murky. These weren't vague nods, think specifics about Houthi movements, intercepted chatter, or drone surveillance fueling the strike plans. If Ratcliffe was in the mix, his intel was the backbone of the operation, the kind of classified juice that could shift battlefields or topple regimes if compromised. Discussing it on Signal wasn't just risky, it was a five-alarm fire. An app, even encrypted, couldn't match the ironclad safeguards of government systems. One breach, say, a hacked phone or a foreign spy sniffing the airwaves in Americas. Eyes in Yemen could go blind. The mere hint of such intel in the chat jacked up the scandal's stakes, turning a sloppy leak into a potential national security meltdown. The Hegseth's case for urgent sight. Hegseth, the defense secretary, wasn't about to let Vance's caution slow the train. On March 14th, he fired back, rejecting any delay with a trio of arguments. The risk of leaks, ironic, in hindsight, Israel's potential unilateral moves, and a fragile Gaza ceasefire that could collapse if the Houthis weren't checked. His reasoning peeled back the curtain on the administration's calculus. A leak could tip off the Houthis, sure, but Hegseth feared Israel might strike first, stealing Trump's thunder or sparking a broader mess. The Gaza angle tied it to a bigger chessboard: keep the Houthis quiet, and the region might hold. It was a glimpse into the urgency driving the strikes, a mix of geopolitics and bravado. But it didn't excuse the venue. Hegseth's logic was sound. His platform was a sieve. The bombshell, Hegseth's operational playbook, the chat's climax, hit on March 15th at 11:44 a.m. ET, when Hegseth dropped his team update. This wasn't a pep talk, it was a war plan in black and white, named Houthi targets individuals. Not just sites, weapons, drones, missiles, precision strikes, and a step-by-step attack sequence. Sent hours before the bombs fell, it was the scandal's crown jewel, a breach so blatant it defied belief. Goldberg, the outsider, now held actionable military intel, the kind that could have derailed the mission if published preemptively. That it didn't leak sooner was dumb luck, not design. Hegseth's message wasn't just reckless. It was a textbook violation of every security protocol in the book. Lives, assets, and credibility hung in the balance, all because the defense secretary treated Signal like a whiteboard. The after-party, cheers amid the Shahbaz strike. The mood flipped. As Yemen smoldered on March 15th, the chat lit up with congratulations, high-fives emojis, a virtual victory lap. The strikes had landed, the Houthis were reeling, and the group basked in the glow of a job well done. It was a jarring contrast to the disaster brewing beneath. They'd pulled off the operation, yes, but the leaked Goldberg's silent presence loomed like a guillotine. The celebratory tone suggested either blissful ignorance or a shrugging off of the breach. Did they not know he was there, or did they not care? Either way, it painted a picture of a team so caught up in the win, they missed the war. They'd just started against their own credibility. The big picture, a house divided, a secret, spelledly Houthi PC small group, was a microcosm of the Trump administration, driven, divided, and dangerously sloppy. Waltz's coordination showed intent. Vance's pushback revealed doubt. Hegseth's urgency and details sealed the deal. The intel whispers added gravity. The cheers a bizarre coda. Together, it was a masterclass in how to plan a strike hand, how to botch its secrecy. That it all unfolded with Goldberg in the room turned a tactical triumph into a strategic nightmare. The chat wasn't just a leak, it was a mirror, reflecting a government racing toward action but stumbling over its own safeguards. As the messages piled up, so did the consequences, and the world was about to see them all. The story deepens, unraveling the abyssed hum of unease that had begun as a faint tremor now swelled into a roar, echoing through the shadowed halls of government. It wasn't just that military plans' intricate strategies for an imminent strike were being discussed on Signal, an unclassified app. It was the sheer audacity of the choice that stunned those in the know. This wasn't a platform built for secrets. It was a civilian tool, a flimsy shield against the sophisticated threats lurking in the digital ether. National security demanded ironclad systems, encrypted classified channels, where every word was locked behind layers of protection. Yet here were officials entrusted with the nation's safety, tossing caution aside as if it were an outdated formality. The breach wasn't hypothetical. It was a live wire, crackling with the potential for leaks to hostile governments, cyber attacks from unseen enemies, or betrayal from within. Every message sent was a gamble, and the stakes were nothing less than the lives tied to those plans. Then came the revelation that turned the situation from reckless to catastrophic. Jeffrey Goldberg's name on the group chat, a journalist, sharp-eyed, influential, and utterly unauthorized, had been dropped into the heart of a discussion no outsider should ever see. The how and why gnawed at everyone. Had it been a careless click, a moment of distraction, or was it something deliberate, a leak disguised as a mistake? The group's members scrambled to retrace their steps, but the truth remained elusive, shrouded in a fog of disbelief. Security protocols weren't just guidelines. They were the backbone of operational integrity, drilled into every official. From day one, a single breach like this, a reporter amid classified chatter, shattered that backbone, exposing a failure so profound it bordered on surreal. Fingers pointed in every direction, but the question lingered. How had the system crumbled so completely? The legal shadow loomed larger still. Experts poring over the Espionage Act didn't mince words. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. The law was a sledgehammer, forged to punish those who mishandled the nation's defenses. Sharing operational details of a military strike with an outsider, even by accident, wasn't a gray area, it was a neon-lit violation. Intent might mitigate the fallout, but the act itself was damning. Investigations were inevitable. They'd dig into every message, every decision, every name tied to the chat. Careers would topple, reputations would burn, and the courts might yet decide who paid the ultimate price. The officials involved weren't just facing embarrassment, they were staring down a legal abyss, one where innocence felt like a thin defense against the weight of their error. For Jeffrey Goldberg, the breach was a gift and a curse. He hadn't sought it, fate or incompetence had thrust it into his lap. But the choice he faced was a labyrinth of its own. Publishing the story meant wielding a double-edged sword. The public would see the government's naked failure, a rare glimpse behind the curtain of power, yet every word he wrote could tip the scales of national security. Lives hung in that balance, soldiers on the ground, civilians in the crosshairs, alliances strained by exposure. Ethicists might argue he had a duty to stay silent, to protect the greater good. But journalists lived by a different creed: truth, no matter the cost. Goldberg wrestled with it, sleepless nights blurring into days. In the end, the scale tipped toward the public's right to know. The breach itself was the story of government so careless it invited accountability, demanded daylight. He typed, he published, and the world shifted. Peel back the layers, and the rot ran deeper still. Signal wasn't just a tool, it was a symptom. Why had officials sidestepped secure channels for something so casual, so vulnerable? The answer lay in a culture of shortcuts, a creeping informality that had taken root in the highest ranks. Military plans weren't barroom banter. They were the arteries of a nation's survival. Yet here they were, traded like gossip over a commercial app. It spoke to a disconnect, a fraying of discipline where policy should have been airtight. Missteps like this didn't just invite leaks. They bred confusion, misaligned orders, and gaps for enemies to exploit. The chat was a microcosm of a larger unraveling, trust eroding, systems buckling, and a government teetering on the edge of its own hubris. What began as a whisper on a screen had become a deafening reckoning, one that would leave scars far beyond the headlines. The story escalates, a political firestorm. Reckoning that had begun as a whisper in the shadows now erupted into a full-blown tempest, shaking the foundations of the Trump administration. From the Senate floor, Chuck Schumer's voice thundered. branding the breach one of the most staggering military intelligence failures in recent memory. The Senate Majority Leader didn't mince words. He demanded a full investigation, his tone laced with outrage and urgency. For Democrats, this wasn't just a mistake. It was a golden opportunity to wield the scandal as a battering ram against their rivals. The political fallout was immediate and brutal, a tidal wave of criticism crashing over the White House. In a polarized Washington, a security blunder of this magnitude was blood in the water, and the opposition smelled it. Accountability wasn't just a buzzword, it was a war cry. The calls for investigation multiplied like wildfire. Democratic lawmakers, emboldened by Schumer's lead, pushed for a formal probe, their voices rising in unison. They wanted answers. How deep did the breach go? Who knew what and when? The machinery of Congress creaked into motion. Hearings loomed on the horizon, promising public spectacles where officials would squirm under oath. Oversight would tighten. For the administration, it was a nightmare scenario, a spotlight searing through their defenses, exposing every crack and flaw. The probe wouldn't just uncover facts, it would fuel a narrative of incompetence, one that could haunt Trump's tenure for years. Inside the Oval Office, the pressure was suffocating. Whispers turned to reports. Trump was weighing the axe, and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz's head was on the chopping block. The leak had spiraled beyond a mere embarrassment. It was a crisis, demanding a sacrifice. Waltz, a key figure in the administration's security apparatus, now stood as a lightning rod for the blame. Firing him wouldn't erase the breach, but it might signal strength, a public mea culpa, to appease the baying crowd. Trump's team knew the optics mattered. In action, could paint him as weak, complicit even. The president's fury was palpable, though whether it stemmed from the breach itself or the political bind it created was anyone's guess. Either way, someone had to pay. Trump's own response was a study in contradiction. At first, he played the outsider card. "I don't know anything about this," he declared, shrugging off the Atlantic's reporting as insignificant. It was vintage Trump. Deny, deflect, diminish. But then came the pivot, a half-joking quip about the leak, a smirk that belied the gravity of the moment. To some, it was a misstep, a tone-deaf stumble in a crisis. To others, it was the old playbook, a bid to wrestle the narrative back with bravado. He'd danced this dance before. Scandals were storms to weather, not reckonings to face. Yet this time, the stakes felt different. The breach wasn't just a PR hit, it was a national security wound, and his casual sidestep couldn't fully staunch the bleeding. The Defense Secretary, Hegseth, dug in his heels. War plans? What war plans? He snapped, dismissing the signal chats as benign and turning his fire on Goldberg. It was a defiant stance, a wall of denial thrown up against the mounting evidence. Hegseth framed it as a smear, a journalist's overreach, but his words rang hollow to those who'd seen the fallout unfold. His refusal to acknowledge the breach's severity, sharing operational details on an unsecured APUS, less a defense, and more a desperate shield. Damage control was the game, and he played it with the tenacity of a man fighting for his political life. But the harder he pushed back, the more he exposed the administration's fractured front. Even the Republicans, Trump's loyal base, couldn't fully close ranks. While their voices were quieter, a thread of unease wove through their ranks. National security breaches weren't partisan, they were universal red lines. Some GOP figures murmured concern behind closed doors, aware that a leak this reckless could boomerang back on their own agenda. It wasn't loud dissent, not yet, but it hinted at a rare crack in the party's armor. The scandal transcended tribal lines, tugging at a shared instinct. A nation's safety couldn't be gambled away on a messaging app. For Trump, it was a bitter pill. The enemy wasn't just across the aisle, but lurking in his own shadow. The White House was a pressure cooker now, each move dissected, each word weaponized. What had started as a careless chat had ignited a political inferno, and the flames were far from contained. The story tightens, voices of defense and deflection as the political inferno raged. The administration scrambled to douse the flames with a flurry of official statements, each one a calculated move in a high-stakes chess game. The National Security Council stepped into the fray first, their words measured but revealing. They didn't deny the signal chat's existence. Those damning messages were real, and Goldberg's inexplicable presence was undeniable. They framed it as a puzzle under investigation. How had a journalist's phone number slipped into the mix? Yet, in the same breath, they downplayed the security fallout, pivoting to a brighter spotlight, the Houthi campaign's success. It was classic damage control. Admit the mess, but drown it in a victory lap. The NSC wasn't just responding. They were rewriting the story, hoping the public's gaze would shift from the breach to the battlefield triumph. But the cracks in their narrative were hard to miss. Pete Hegseth, still bristling from the accusations, doubled down on his defiance. War plans. I never texted war plans, he insisted, his voice sharp with indignation. He swung at Goldberg next, branding him a discredited hack, a storyteller unfit to wield such a scoop. It was a bold counterpunch, aimed at the heart of the scandal's credibility. Yet for all his bluster, Hegseth sidestepped the real charge. Those operational details, sensitive enough to spark a firestorm, had flowed through his fingers on an unsecured app. His denial was a shield, not a solution, a bid to tarnish the messenger while dodging the message. To those watching closely, it felt less like exoneration and more like a cornered man grasping for leverage. From the White House, Caroline Leavitt's voice cut through the chaos with a different tune. President Trump has full confidence in Mike Waltz and the national security team, she declared, her tone unwavering. It was a lifeline tossed to the embattled national security advisor, a public embrace amid whispers of his impending doom. The statement clashed with the rumor-strump's supposed fury. The talk of firings, but that was the point. This wasn't about truth. It was about optics, a temporary bulwark to steady a reeling administration. Behind closed doors, the president might still be sharpening the axe, but for now, Leavitt's words bought time. A fragile truce in a war of perception. The vice president's camp weighed in next, their spin more delicate. J.D. Vance's spokesperson insisted he stood firmly behind the administration's foreign policy. Despite his own doubts flickering in that leaked chat, it was a tightrope act acknowledging the internal friction while plastering over it with loyalty. Vance had questioned the plan's wisdom, his words captured in the signal thread, but public unity trumped private qualms. This was the dance of power. Dissent simmered in the shadows, only to be smoothed into solidarity when the spotlight glared. The statement aimed to quiet the murmurs of division, but it couldn't erase the tension humming beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the State Department chose silence. Tammy Bruce, their spokesperson, brushed off inquiries with a curt refusal to comment. It was a stark contrast to the flurry of defenses elsewhere. Cautious sidestep from an agency wary of the spotlight. Was it ignorance, a lack of briefing on the fiasco, or a deliberate retreat, a refusal to stoke the controversy's flames? Either way, their silence spoke volumes, a void where clarity might have steadied the ship. In a crisis this raw, every word, lack thereof, carried weight. And the State Department's absence left room for speculation to fester. The administration's chorus of voices defiant, deflecting, reassuring formed a fragile shield. Against the onslaught, each statement was a brick in a crumbling wall, holding back the tide of accountability for one more day. But the scandal's roots ran deep, and the ground beneath them trembled still. The story expands. A nation unmoored. Scandal's shadow stretched far beyond the White House, seeping into the marrow of America's national security like a slow poison. Trust, that elusive currency of governance, didn't just erode it, shattered. The public, long accustomed to viewing their leaders as sentinels of secrecy, now saw them as reckless gamblers, tossing classified plans onto a digital roulette wheel. The signal breach wasn't a mere slip. It was a betrayal of faith, a neon sign flashing incompetence to a nation already weary of its rulers. Every citizen who scrolled the headline's military strategies on an app, a journalist in the loop, felt the sting of vulnerability. If the government couldn't guard its own house, how could it protect theirs? Abroad, the reverberations were sharper still. Allies like Germany and Japan, partners in a web of shared intelligence, didn't just question Washington's reliability, they recalculated it. Briefings once offered freely might now come with asterisks, hesitations, locked vaults. Meanwhile, adversaries Russia, China, Iran watched with predatory glee, cataloging the lapse as both a blueprint for exploitation and a propaganda coup. The administration's prestige, already battered by partisan wars, now lay in tatters, a casualty of its own hubris. The future of military operations hung in a haze of doubt. Every strategist, every general, now carried the breach like a scar. Planning a strike, whether a surgical hit or a sprawling campaign once, flowed with the urgency of necessity. Now, it stuttered under the weight of paranoia. What if an encrypted line wasn't enough? What if a secure channel hid a traitor's ear? The Houthi operation, touted as a win, cast a long shadow. Its success was tainted by the knowledge that its birth had been broadcast to the wrong eyes. Decision-making slowed, bogged down by layers of second-guessing. A colonel might draft a plan only to shred it, fearing a stray screenshot. A Pentagon briefing might stall as officers debated who truly needed to know. Inside the government, the chill was palpably information, once shared with the trust of comrades, became a hoarded treasure. Departments siloed, wary of their own. The breach hadn't just exposed secrets, it had fractured the machinery of defense, leaving it sluggish, suspicious, and perilously brittle. The response in Washington was a scramble for control. The days of texting on Signal or any app not stamped with a security clearance were over, buried under a deluge of oversight. Congressional committees, their gavels poised, demanded audits of every device in every official's hand. A cabinet member's phone became a liability. Why had a general's chat history read like a spy novel? The answers weren't just embarrassing, they were actionable. New policies unfurled like barbed wire. No unclassified platforms, no personal devices, no exceptions. Agencies like the NSA and CIA, already labyrinths of rules, tightened the screws. Further, their IT teams racing to scrub vulnerabilities. Training sessions multiplied hours of lectures on encryption, on phishing, on the 1,000 ways a single click could unravel a nation. For the rank-and-file, it was a suffocating shift. For the architects of security, it was a desperate bid to reclaim lost ground. The bureaucracy swelled, its pace slowed, but the intent was unyielding. Never again would a breach this careless slip through. Yet, in the ashes of disgrace, a faint phoenix stirred. The fiasco was a brutal lesson, but lessons could be wielded. National security protocols, complacent in their routines, had been stress-tested to the breaking point and they'd snapped. Now, the pieces could be Imagine a system reborn, communications locked behind quantum-grade encryption, access tiered with biometric precision, audits relentless and real-time, picture training not as a checkbox but a mindset, drilled into every soul from interns to secretaries of state. The breach was a mirror, reflecting every flaw, lax habits, outdated tech, human error, and demanding they be burned away. Experts in shadowed rooms sketched blueprints for resilience, redundant safeguards, AI-driven anomaly detectors, a culture where security wasn't just policy, but instinct. It wouldn't erase the past, but it could armor the future. The cost was steep time, money, trust, but the alternative was unthinkable. This was the pivot, from negligence to ironclad resolve. If only the will held firm, the world stage too buckled under the strain. Those leaked chats hadn't just spilled military moves, they'd flung open a window into America's unvarnished soul. Europe, a linchpin of U.S. alliances, flinched at the barbs buried in the signal thread, candid jabs at their readiness, their resolve, their worth. Out of their depth, one message sneered about NATO partners, dragging their feet. Another griped, words meant for private vents now echoed in foreign capitals, their sting amplified by publicity. Diplomats in Brussels and Berlin didn't rage, they simmered, their trust in Washington fraying at the edges. Every joint exercise, every intelligence swap, now carried a shadow of doubt. The State Department, still cloaked in silence, faced a Herculean task. Phone calls to soothe, summits to reassure, promises to rebuild. But words alone wouldn't mend. This the Allies wanted proof, tangible acts, to outweigh the insult. Beyond the West, foes pounced. Moscow aired the leaks on state TV, Beijing wove them into subtle taunts. The breach wasn't just a national wound, it was a geopolitical fault line, splitting alliances and emboldening rivals. The administration stood on a precipice. What began as a careless message had metastasized into a crisis of faith, military, global. The path forward was treacherous. rebuild or unravel, fortify or fracture. The nation watched, the world waited, and the clock ticked relentlessly on. The story closes. A reckoning in the digital Hegseth tale that began with a careless tap on a screen now reached its somber end. A saga etched in the annals of the Trump administration's turbulent reign. At its core was a staggering blunder. Senior officials, tasked with safeguarding the nation, had dragged Jeffrey Goldberg, editor of The Atlantic, into a signal chat buzzing with plans for a Yemen strike. What unfolded wasn't just a breach, it was a gaping wound in the fabric of national security, laid bare for all to see. The use of an unclassified app for such sensitive talks, coupled with the accidental exposure of operational secrets to a journalist, wasn't a mere misstep, was a siren blaring through the corridors of power. It screamed of recklessness, of a government so cavalier with its duties that it invited disaster. Questions swirled, sharp and unrelenting. How could protocols so vital be cast aside? What did this say about the administration's grasp of the stakes? The backlash was swift and fierce. Democrats, led by the thunderous voice of Chuck Schumer, seized the scandal like a battering ram, decrying it as a staggering intelligence failure and demanding a full probe. Their outrage wasn't just political theater, it channeled a deeper alarm, a fear that the nation's defenses hung by a thread. Legal shadows loomed too, with whispers of the Espionage Act casting a pall over those involved. The administration's first response, a cocktail of denial, deflection, and downplaying, did little to quell the storm. Trump's quips and shrugs, Hegseth's bristling counterattacks, the NSC's strained pivot to victories elsewhere all fell flat against the gravity of the breach. Pressure mounted on the president himself, with rumors swirling of Mike Waltz's head on the block. The White House was a fortress under siege, its walls trembling as accountability closed in. The broader fallout carved a scar across national security that would not soon fade. Trust, both domestic and global, bled out with every headline. Americans, peering through the lens of Goldberg's, saw not just a mistake, but a administration that couldn't shield its secrets, let alone its people. Allies, from NATO's capitals to Pacific outposts, recalibrated their faith in U.S. discretion, their intelligence sharing tinged with caution. Foes gloated, armed with fresh fodder to exploit. Future operations, once honed with precision, now faced a gauntlet of doubt planners, paralyzed by the specter of leaks, decisions mired in overcaution. The breach didn't just expose a plan, it hobbled the machinery of defense, leaving it slower, warier, and dangerously exposed. Yet the scandal bore a bitter fruit of necessity. It thrust a harsh light on the government's digital vulnerabilities, demanding a reckoning. Oversight tightened, protocols sharpened signals, casual reign was over, replaced by a lattice of stricter rules and relentless scrutiny. The breach became a catalyst, a chance to forge resilience from ruin. Stronger encryption, rigorous training, a culture of vigilance, these weren't just options, but imperatives. Internationally, the leaked barbs about Europe strained alliances, forcing diplomats into a frantic dance of repair. The cost was steep, the lessons brutal, but the path forward glimmered with faint hope. A nation could learn, adapt, and endure its final reckoning. The signal scandal stood as a stark parable of the digital age, warning of how fragile security becomes when vigilance falters. It underscored the weight of leadership, the need for unwavering discipline at every level. The nation's interests, its soldiers' lives, hung in that balance, and the breach had tipped it perilously close to collapse. As the dust settled, the administration faced a choice: rise from the ashes with resolve, or let the fracture deepen. The story closed not with triumph, but with a question: would they heed the call? Well, there you have it. A cautionary tale about the dangers of technology, the importance of proofreading your messages, and the interesting ways we can learn English. I hope you enjoyed this wild ride as much as I did. And remember, if you're ever added to a top-secret government group chat, maybe double-check before you hit send. If this story made you laugh, think, or even just scratch your head in confusion, please give it a like. Share it with anyone who needs a good dose of political intrigue or a reminder to be careful with their phone. Subscribe to English for more unbelievable and sometimes fictionalized stories that will boost your English skills. And don't forget to leave a comment. We love hearing from you. Until next time, keep those messages secure and keep learning.